The Parlor Cemetery by C.E. Howard. Good morning. I'm getting the information for the new city directory. May I step in and rest a moment while I'm asking you a few questions? Well, yes. I reckon you can come in and set, conceded the old lady, who had answered my knock. But I won't give you no order, mister. I hain't much of a booker. Oh, I don't sell the books, I hastened to assure her as I laid my sample volume on the floor by my chair and placed my hat on it. I just go around from house to house gathering the names for it. The company publishes and sells the books. I don't have anything to do with that part of it. Oh, you just do the authoring. It must take you considerable time to write as big a book as that. Do you do it all alone? No, we have 54 men working on it now, and it'll take about 2 months to get it all. Now may I ask, how much does it cost? This year they'll sell for $15. A piece? She shrilled. My land a-livin'. Whoever buys the things? All the big stores keep them, especially the drugstores, for the benefit of the public, you know. Now your name is... Well, what's it all about, anyhow? She insisted. And what's it for? Is it a telephone dictionary? Something like that. It contains the names and addresses of everybody living in the city, and all the big establishments keep one so that if anybody wishes to find out where anybody else lives, they just go in some store and look in this dictionary, and there it is. Now, will you give me your name for the new book, please? My name? Why, my name is... Now, is this going to cost me anything? You know I said I wouldn't take none afore I let you in. It will not cost you a cent, I told her earnestly. And it may do you some good, see, running through the leaves of the book in which I entered the statistics. How many people I interviewed this morning. And all them gave me the information I asked for. Now you'll see all there is to it. Right down here on the top line, I write your name. What did you say it was? I never said it yet, but it was Cook. Ah, we were off at last. Cook. I paused at the K and asked, do you spell it the short way or with an E? Which? How do you spell it? C-O-O-K or C-O-O-K-E? No, not with no E onto it. That would be Cookie. It was just plain Cook. C-O-O-K. I was willing to let it go at that, and wrote it down. And your first name now? My first name? I don't tell my first name to no strangers, especially men. I beg your pardon, but I am not asking that from impertinence, Mrs. Cook, I explained carefully. We do not mean to pry into people's personal affairs. Such things are of no concern to us. But you see there are probably 100 or more cooks in this city, and if we didn't have their first names, there would be no telling them apart. All the ladies so far have told me their first names, I declared, holding my book toward her with the evidence. After peering at it intently for some time, she relaxed in her chair, reassured. Well, 'tain't no name to be ashamed of, if 'tis old-fashioned. It's Anne. Anne. A-N-N. I spelled aloud, to give her the chance to correct me if necessary, thinking of the famous query connected with that name, and thankful I didn't have to ask that too. I continued, You have a husband? No, not now. I've had 'em, though. Ah, a widow, then. That is, I presume your husband is not alive, Mrs. Cook? I essayed gently, avoiding, as always, the direct interrogation as to grass widowship. No, they all on 'em dead now. But, mister, my name ain't Cook. It's Hay. What? I exclaimed. Why, I understood you to say it was Cook. Well, you understood right. It was Cook. That's what you asked me, what it was. But it's Hay now. 'Bout 2 years after Cook went up in smoke, I married a feller named Hay, see? Oh, yes. I smiled cheerfully, and reversing my pencil, I endeavored to rub off the former husband's name. Of course, the flimsy paper tore. I yanked out the sheet and began again. H-A-Y. Hay. I put down, writing lightly with an eye to more erasures or corrections. Just the plain, short Hay, I presume. Yes, just the plain Hay. Not Timothy, nor alfalfy, nor none of them fancy hoss breakfast foods. My land, she broke in astonishment. I should think the company'd get men to do this work that could spell. This is one of the things that we're told to be most careful about, Miss, Hay. We must always ask everybody's name and just how they spell it, even if we think we know. Often people having the same sounding name spell it differently, and if it goes in the directory wrong, they generally blame us. And now, may I ask, I said sympathetically, recalling the particular way in which she had spoken of the late Mr. Cook's decease, if your former husband lost his life in a fire? Who? Cook? Oh, you mean what I mean when I spoke of him going up in smoke? No, he was plumb dead. I was satisfied of that afore he was burned. That's the way I've had 'em all done. Kind of a habit I got into, I reckon, but seems to me 'twas a pretty good habit. That's Cook, second from the right-hand end. She was calmly pointing to an object on the humble mantel, as though she were indicating a specimen in a museum. How? What? I gasped, as every separate hair on my head arose and tried to spring from its root cell. Why, I had all my husband's bodies consumed by fire. What do you call it? Cremated. When they up and left me, that's the ashes of all of 'em, in them dishes there. Seems to be the best way to do with dead folks. Have your own cemetery right in your house where it's handy. It's specially nice when one moves round a good deal like I've done. I never could afford to go on visitin' here and there to that many graves scattered about in different states. Besides, it saves tombstones and the expense of taking care of the lots. Gradually, I grasped the woman's meaning, and she continued to rock back and forth and utter her placid Mrs. Jarley explanation. The men who had been so unfeelingly abrupt as to up and leave, this poor creature had evidently, each in his turn, been cremated. And now their ashes, side by side, served to adorn the mantel and to comfort the heart of the faithful widow. Imperial Caesar, dead and turned to clay. I gazed at the row of assorted receptacles with awe, and back at the woman with feelings still more curious. Some folks thinks them odd kind of coffins, she continued, but I don't know what could be more appropriate. You see, I've tried to have each one sort of represent either the man hisself or his trade. Now, for instance, this here one, she explained, rising and placing her hand on a small stone jar at the left end of the line. There were 5 of these unique memorials altogether. This was my first husband, John Marmaduke. The label on the crock, you'll notice, is Marmalade. And that's pert near his name. And then it almost describes his disposition, too. The grocer told me that marmalade was a kind of English jam, and John was sort of sweet-tempered for a man, so I thought one of them stunned things would do fine to keep him in. This is William Thompson here, she continued, tapping a small tea caddy with her thimble. He was a teacher, and I always called him Mr. T. So when he departed, I thinks to myself, thinks I, one of them little chests the Chinamans put tea in is just the ticket for you. T standing for both his name and his calling. Do you see? I expressed my admiration for this delightful idea, and she proceeded with her cataloging. This third collection, in the fruit jar, is Mason. That was his name, and his trade, too, and he belonged to that lodge, and that's the make of the jar. So considerin' all them facts, I don't know what could be a fitter tomb for him. Mason fell off the roof one day and broke his back, and though he lived 6 months, somehow, he was never much count arter that. He was a big man, weighed 225 afore breakfast, and he made such a pile of ashes, spite of their keeping him in the oven double time, and it took a gallon jar to hold his leavin's. I had some quart jars on hand already, and 'spected to put him in one of 'em, but I never begrudged buying a bigger one, for he was always, or pert near always, generous with me. And then I knew I was saving an undertaker's bill anyhow. Now I wasn't altogether satisfied with the coffin I finally chose for Cook, she said, looking at me doubtfully, as she motioned toward the small, jam-panned tin bread box that was the next mortuary souvenir on the shelf. I worried over the matter the whole time he was sick, but I never got a mite of help from him. Every time I tried to get the man to suggest what he thought he'd rest comfortable in, he'd go on frightful. Doctor said his temper probably shortened his life. Well, at last I decided on the bread box, as comin' as near to representin' him as anything I could think on, his name bein' Cook, and havin' occupated as a baker as long as he was live. What's your opinion about it, mister? I declared that if Mr. Cook did not now rest in peace and content, he was certainly a hard man to please. The last one there, as I told you, she went on with something like animation, is Mr. Hay, and I do feel considerable proud over his casket. It sure was a happy thought of mine. See?" She took down the object and held it in the sunlight where I could get a plainer view. "He died just last year." Mr. Hay's ashes reposed in one of the large, square glass perfume bottles, such as most druggists carry, and the ornate label thereon had become the painfully true epitaph, "New Mown Hay." When I could trust my voice, I inquired, "Was he ill long?" "Nah, he wasn't ill 'tall. He left me kinda unexpectedly. However, he always was a great man for doing things on the impulse of the moment. He was living out on a farm then, and one day Mr. Hay was cutting grass in the orchard, and I s'pose he must have struck a nest of bees. Anyhow, something started the team, and they ran away and throwed him off in front of the knives, and the horses stepped on him a few times, and the machine finished him up. He certainly was most completely dead when we reached him. Hired man told me he had to gather him up with a rake and wheelbarrow. Only 46 years old, too. He was mowed down in his prime. Well, this is a funny world, ain't it? Some woman can take one man and keep him live and whole for 50 or 60 years. But I sure had bad luck with my batch of husbands. It's a comfort to me, though, that I can have 'em with me in death at least. I take down their monuments every morning and dust 'em off. And when I go on the keers visiting anywheres, I pack one in my valise and carry it along. When I get it out and put it up in my room, wherever I be, I feel right at home." I succeeded in getting answers to the rest of my questions in another half hour, and went on my way, dazed. And though when the day's work was over, I had no rare bit for supper, yet a vision came to me sometime between the dark and the daylight. I thought I saw myself fall ill and die, and my body was prepared for cremation. I struggled to escape, to call out, but in vain. They slid me into a kiln, and the inexorable heat dissolved flesh, blood, and bone. Then some brutal, careless wretch came and swept me up in a dustpan, and put me in a sack and delivered me over to an eager old woman, whose face seemed strangely familiar. This ghoulish woman bore me away to her home, and went to work trying to pat me down in a catsup bottle. It was too small. It seemed to press on my throat. I was choking. I struggled. I shrieked. And I awoke to find, thank heaven, that a large crayon portrait above my bed had fallen down and was now around my neck, and the man in the next room was hammering on the wall with his shoe and shouting and swearing at me.